humanitarian corridor will actually be set up, really, and those words be put in action.
Exactly, especially also because we hear that the attacks increase. What are you hearing from Kiev? People there have been bracing for a full Russian assault for days now.
That assault did not happen. In fact, a lot of military gear, tanks, and the soldiers are in the outskirts, basically, of Kiev, around 20 to 30 kilometers outside of the city center. It's unclear, actually, why. There's a lot of speculation around it. Low moral, a lack of very basics like gasoline to move ahead, and everyone is expecting them to regroup now and to look for a new strategy. People on the ground in Kiev are concerned that that strategy may only mean what we see play out in Kharkiv already, that basically people have to spend not just their nights but days in bomb shelters because shelling is so intense. No one exactly knows what's just going to happen in Kiev in the next couple of days, even though everyone is expecting the worst. And in that situation comes the appeal of President Zelensky urging to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. But we have heard yesterday at the NATO meeting that NATO clearly says this is not our conflict, we don't want to get involved. So there obviously also a level of frustration here on the Ukrainian government side, because they feel this bombardment continues on so many levels, on so many cities, but they feel, how are we actually going to win this war, they say, against Russia if there is no increasing help here to appeal the Russian forces to continuously appeal them.
Right, Fanny Fashade reporting from Western Ukraine. Thank you. And the US ambassador to the United Nations says that Russian forces are closing in on Ukraine's second largest nuclear plant. She told the UN Security Council that they're now about 30 kilometers from Yuzhno-Ukrainsk in the south. On Friday, Ukraine said it narrowly avoided nuclear disaster at its largest nuclear plant, Zaporizhzhia, when Russia seized control of the facility. Russian troops fired shells at the plant, killing several people and sparking a fire. Authorities say the reactors were not damaged and no radioactive material was released. For more, let's bring in Mikhail Bushev from the DW Russia desk in Bonn. Mikhail, what more do we know about this second largest nuclear plant, its safety mechanisms, the situation there right now?
Good morning. Yes, we know something about the situation from the workers still allowed to do their work, but they're exhausted. That's what the director of the atomic plant told the reporters. The situation is pretty critical. As far as we still don't know if the safety of the plant is guaranteed. There are no signals whatsoever about radiation. The director also said that the workers could not do all the checks needed to establish the level of radiation, but the International Atomic Energy Agency also told that other monitoring stations didn't check any rising radiation levels whatsoever in Europe. It's a huge atomic plant. It has 6 reactors. It's relatively new. The last one was built and started to produce energy in 1995. So, and it's huge. Its importance for Ukraine shouldn't be underestimated. I think it's around about 20% of the whole.
Right, Mikhail, but the worrying thing is that that largest plant, nuclear plant in Europe, is already under Russian control, and Russian troops are now moving in towards the second largest plant. What's Russia trying to achieve by attacking nuclear power plants? What's the end game here?
Well, there are some signals that Russia is sending by doing that. First of all, it looks like a severe breach of Geneva Convention, especially the additional protocol of 1977, which calls that no atomic energy plant may ever be attacked. So that's the one point. So they are signaling that they are ready to do whatever it takes to have their win over Ukraine, and it's kind of blackmailing and a show of force. We are ready use whatever we need, and if it would be an explode at an atomic plant, we'll do that. That's basically signaling of readiness.
That is a worrying thought there. Mikhail Bushev, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The UN Refugee Agency says more than 1.2 million people have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries. Many of them are children fleeing with their mothers, while Ukrainian men stay and fight. Helpers in neighboring countries say children are arriving traumatized. DW correspondent Monika Zhirajka reports from Przemysl, near the Polish border with Ukraine.
Around 40,000 people are arriving here each day. One refugee from Ukraine told me, war is something for adults, not for children. The children of Ukraine are fleeing war and are arriving here at this railway station near the border. They bring with them the trauma of upheaval, fear, and sometimes wars.
If there had been no war, our houses would have stood. My grandfather now sleeps with a gun. I think we can do it, that it will get better in Ukraine and that we will win. I cannot say anything. I waited so long, I cried so much, I have nothing to say. We spent a very long time on the train and a very long time standing. I'm grateful to Poland that it welcomes our compatriots in this way. What do you feel now? Joy. Joy. Sometimes there were sirens in the evening that people hid all day in cellars and bunkers. My father is in Ukraine. A lot of my relatives also stayed. I'm afraid that many people will die because of this war.
Who is prepared to talk to their children about war? The parents are in shock themselves. Their country suddenly engulfed in war. The big picture is overwhelming. The focus for now is on their children.
We in Zaporozhye do not need to explain anything. The children there have seen everything with their own eyes. The situation there is difficult. They felt it all around them. Every day they sat in cellars without light, water, or heating. When our region came under heavy fire, when tanks were visible, the children were afraid. They said, "Mom, we're scared. Can we leave?" The children understood that there was a war, but they didn't understand why. Why were people shooting at each other? I don't explain it to them because I believe they're too young. In general, they know that there's a war, that there are explosions, and that someone wants to take our homeland away from us.
The war in Ukraine is changing everything. Here, a new generation of European refugees carry the baggage of trauma into their new lives.
You're watching DW News live from Berlin. There's plenty more news and plenty more information on our website. That is dw.com. I'm Monika Jones in Berlin from me and the team here. Thanks for watching. We'll be back with the latest at the top of the hour. See you then.
Stories that move people the world over. Information they provide. Opinions they want to express. DW on Facebook and Twitter. Up to date and in touch. Follow us. Are you ready to get a little more extreme? These places in Europe are smashing all the records. Step into a bold adventure. Just don't lose your grip. It's the treasure map for modern globetrotters. Discover some of Europe's record-breaking sights on Euromax, YouTube, and now also in book form.
Vladimir Putin's announcement at the weekend that he was increasing the alert level of Russia's nuclear forces is raising fears that the war that Russia has launched against Ukraine could turn into something even more dangerous, some kind of nuclear conflict. Well, I've taken a few minutes out of the TV studio here in Berlin at DW to speak to one of the world's leading experts on nuclear weapons. His name is James Acton. He's based at the Carnegie Endowment think tank in Washington, D.C. And he writes and researches a lot about nuclear weapons and how escalation can happen between nuclear powers. So I asked him, what exactly, first of all, was it that Vladimir Putin has announced? Please bear with us. There's some banging in the background.
So Putin ordered the Russian defense minister and the Russian chief of staff to increase the alert level of Russia's deterrent forces, which includes, but is not limited to, Russia's nuclear forces. We don't know exactly what that's going to entail in practice. We wait to see. There's been media reporting that the US government has not seen any changes to Russia's nuclear force posture yet. We may not see any. I hope we don't see any.
What is your most likely interpretation of the signal he's trying to achieve with this?
I can offer you various interpretations, but I actually find this quite a difficult threat to understand what Putin is trying to do. One possibility is that he's trying to say to the US, stay out of this conflict, do not intervene directly, which is a threat that he actually made explicitly when he announced his invasion to the Russian people. Another possibility is that he's trying to make the US and its allies change their behavior, to back off, to lift sanctions, to stop supplying equipment and material to Ukraine. Another possibility is that this threat is targeted at Ukraine itself. He's trying to scare them into backing down or increase his leverage at the negotiating table. And given that Russian-Ukrainian negotiations now appear to be ongoing. Part of actually what concerns me here is it's not clear precisely what Putin hopes to achieve through this threat, what specifically he's threatening.
And how should people understand the importance of this, even in any of those interpretations? How unusual is it for a leader, especially a leader of a superpower, to make a threat like this?
It's unusual, but not entirely unprecedented. If you look back through the history of Russian and US-Soviet crises, the last time that one of those states alerted their nuclear forces during a crisis was in October 1973, during the final stages of the Yom Kippur War. So you have to go back almost 50 years to find an occasion, to find the most recent and kind of roughly analogous occasion to this. That, I think, underscores how unusual this kind of nuclear threat actually is. I don't think that Putin is about to launch a nuclear attack tomorrow, but I do think that the danger of nuclear war, the likelihood of nuclear war, is rising. And we should think about this in terms of risk, which is the risk is the product of probability and consequence. And while the probability of a nuclear war is still fortunately quite small, the consequences are so large that the risk here, in my mind, is high right now.
So we have Putin in this situation, making this threat. The Western world is looking at this and thinking, well, what is the best response at this stage? What is your advice to the US administration and leaders here in Europe who are thinking about how their messaging should be now after this threat?
Right now, my advice is twofold. Firstly, it is to stay the course in terms of their military posture at the moment. There is no need whatsoever to increase the alert level of American or British or French nuclear forces. What I would try to do, though, is to give Putin an off-ramp. Ultimately, Ukraine has to negotiate an end to this conflict if it's to survive as a nation state, as well as it's been doing on the battlefield. The extraordinary performances of its armed forces. I think the Ukrainians know that if they want to avoid, the leveling of their cities, as Putin did to Grozny in 1999 to 2000, they have to negotiate. So I think, we should make it clear which sanctions we're willing to lift if Russia and Ukraine can negotiate a ceasefire. I think that is worth something that's conveying to the Russians right now. In short, we have to try to find a way so that Putin can back out of this crisis in a way that leaves Ukraine as an independent state. That's not easy to do. We can't make him take that pathway, but we can at least open the door in the hope that he will walk through it.
But given the fact that he has brought this nuclear threat element into this conflict, how easy is it to back down from such high stakes to accepting a solution which feels well below the rather maximalist war aims with which he went into this conflict?
Putin is faced with a bunch of unattractive options right now, right? Negotiating a ceasefire in a way that preserves Ukraine as an independent state is an unattractive option. Fighting a prolonged war against Ukraine that is a complete bloodbath and results in the deaths of tens and tens of thousands of Russian service members is really unattractive. Using nuclear weapons is really unattractive. So it's not as if Putin has good options here, some that he wants to pursue. He's faced with a bunch of lousy options, and he has to choose the least bad of those. Putin is a position that many leaders find themselves when they launch wars that prove a lot less successful than they hoped they would be. And at the end of the day, almost all wars end through a negotiated process in which each side has to make agonizing concessions that it hates to make. My point is that we should try to speed up that process so that, we make Putin as likely as we can do. There's a lot here that's out of our control. We want to make it as likely as possible that Putin takes this face-saving way out of this crisis as soon as possible in a way that doesn't involve the destruction of Ukrainian cities or worse still, the use of nuclear weapons.
So that would be the kind of positive trajectory where the West can try to nudge Putin towards a positive or a least bad outcome. What's the alternative? Where do you see the risk of a chain of escalations that lead to a nuclear use?
There's various pathways that you can imagine, but the one that honestly worries me the most in this situation is the pathway in which Putin's nuclear threats on this occasion fail, as I think they will. I don't think they're going to cause Ukraine to back down or the US and its allies to back down. And Putin is left fighting a bloodbath of a prolonged conventional war, in which the Russian economy is in tatters, Russian soldiers are being killed left, right, and center. There is no end in sight of this conflict, in which Putin perhaps starts to worry about whether his rule at home might be threatened. So in that kind of scenario, the possibility that as a last desperate roll of the dice to try to bring an end to this conflict, Putin uses nuclear weapons, I can't exclude that possibility, and that's the thing that worries me most.
And what kind of use of nuclear weapons would we be looking at there? Is it where he might use them in Ukraine itself, or that he might use them outside Ukraine as some kind of warning to Western powers? What kind of scenarios can you imagine most likely?
In principle, it could be either of those. I think it's very hard to predict. What I would say is we may learn more in the next few days about Putin's thinking in this regard. It's possible that the alert order was completely a bluff. I think that's unlikely, and that Putin's bluffing theory of international politics hasn't done very well over the last few months. But we could see Russia alert its strategic nuclear forces. That's its nuclear forces that can reach the United States. It might place nuclear warheads on bombers. It might send more submarines to sea. In all of those different cases there, Putin would be clearly leveling a threat at the United States. And if it progressed to nuclear use in that scenario, one would expect Russia's long-range nuclear weapons to be used. Conversely, Russia also has a large variety of non-strategic delivery systems that can't reach the United States. On a day-to-day basis, those delivery systems are not stored with nuclear warheads. If we saw Russia start to move nuclear warheads from the storage locations to the deployment location of its non-strategic weapons, then Russia would likely be trying to convey a nuclear threat to Ukraine. And in that case, if it ended up in nuclear use, then I think the target would be Ukraine. So I think we will know a bit more.
Сейчас, секунду. Да, слушаю.
Евгений Маратович, добрый день.
Да, это я, да, слушаю.
Это вам звонят из Центра детского творчества. Вы к нам подходили по поводу работы.
Да.
Я переговорила с директором. К сожалению, вакансий у нас нет.
Понял.
Да.
Это где вы, подождите, это Делистери, да?
Это клубная 50А.
Клубная 50А.
У нас была договоренность, что я позвоню вам до конца недели.
Ага, ой, понял. Ладно, хорошо, понял.
До свидания.
Понял.
About possible scenarios when and if Russia's nuclear posture visibly changes in the next few days. Hopefully it won't, but if it does, that will give us a bit more about, tell us a bit more about Putin's thinking.
And where is the deterrent effect of the West's nuclear forces here? Because we're talking about actions which would see Vladimir Putin using nuclear weapons where nobody else has used them, and facing the potential for some kind of massive retaliation, perhaps also in a nuclear sense. So, why are these thoughts even possible? possible given the potential retaliatory consequences?
Well, I mean, firstly, Richard, I'd point out that this kind of nuclear use is not unprecedented. In fact, it's the only precedented form of nuclear use, is nuclear use to try to end a conventional war in a way to avoid a huge amount of conventional fighting. Obviously, the big difference between the end of the Second World War in the Pacific and today is Japan didn't have a nuclear-armed ally in 1945. Ukraine, the US isn't a formal ally, but it's a friend of Ukraine. And, I think US nuclear forces and French and British nuclear forces will weigh heavily on Putin's psyche. He would be fully aware that the use of nuclear weapons could lead to retaliation. That's why I think he's unlikely to do it. But I think the rationale here is that he will weigh up the consequences of using them and the consequences of not using them. And if the consequences of not using them appear really terrible, the loss of some dreadful conventional war in a way that threatens, in Putin's mind, grip on power, then I think you start to get in a situation in which you may view the risks of using them as being lower than the risks of not using them.
And you said that, maybe to close here, you said that there hasn't been something, an alert of this nature since 1973. That's a long time ago. How dangerous is this moment? Is it also, do you feel, the most dangerous moment in world affairs since around that time?
I find it very hard to quantify the level of danger that we now face. I do think at the very least this is the most dangerous moment in a US-Russia crisis since not only the end of the Cold War, but at least, the last 5 or so years of the Cold War.
Thanks to James Acton for taking the time today. And if you want to follow more of our coverage of the crisis, then follow us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, and of course on our own website, dw.com.
What's making the headlines and what's behind them?
DW News Africa.
The show that tackles the issues shaping the continent.
Life is slowly getting back to normal here.
We're on the streets to give you in-depth reports and insights.
Our correspondents on the ground reporting from across the continent.
All the trends that matter to you. Next on DW. What people have to say matters to us. That's why we listen to their stories. Reporter, every weekend on DW.
This is DW News Africa. On the program today, the Africans struggling to escape the conflict in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing the fighting in Ukraine. Among them are tens of thousands of African students. We hear how one made it to safety and of her harrowing experience as she tried to get out of the country.
It was very tough. It was horrible. I remember I was shivering, literally.
Plus, countries around the world overwhelmingly denounced Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a UN vote. But why did so many African countries refuse to do so? Also coming up, we will meet the group of Malians calling for their country to ditch Western partners and strengthen ties with Moscow instead. And in another big development this week, one that some are calling a watershed moment for the planet, UN countries gathered at a summit in Nairobi agreed to create a legally binding treaty that they say will end plastic pollution. Hello, I'm Christine Mundwa. It's good to have your company. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a historic mass movement of people not seen in Europe in decades. More than 1 million people have already fled the country, according to the UN's refugee agency, and that number is growing by the day. Among those fleeing Russia's bombs are African students studying at universities in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian officials, there were about 16,000 of them before the conflict began. Some of them have reported receiving racist treatment from Ukrainian officials, who they say pushed them back as they tried to flee. Now, some African students are still